Hey friends. So in this video, what we're going to do is talk about basically what happens now with Jaggar. So as we've seen, the myth of dispassionate investigation is a myth, and it also serves to prop up the values of the dominant class, namely those values that help wealthy white men. What does this myth end up doing? Well, it ends up blinkering, preventing us from fully seeing other ways that we might live, other values that might organize us, right? Organize our lives and organize our society and our culture. So what then do we do, right? At this point, it's like, well, crap. We've got the myth of dispassion, right? We've got this myth that ends up supporting and organizing our culture around a set of values that tend to elevate the status of certain folks and bring down the status of other folks. Well, for Jaggar, what we do is we think about how outlaw emotions might help us reorganize our culture around a set of values that are beneficial to everybody, right? So, first things first. We know that we shouldn't trust all of our emotions, right? After all, if you have knee-jerk emotional responses to certain things that you shouldn't have knee-jerk emotional responses to, right? Then we know that we shouldn't trust those emotions. So when should we trust certain emotions, whether they be outlaw emotions or otherwise? Well, we trust them if those emotions are characteristic of a society in which people thrive. So we trust those emotions. We follow those emotions and those values, consequently, when they help people thrive. So how do we know when those emotions, or how do we know certain emotions reflect or encourage human thriving, right? Because after all, we might imagine that, somebody like, a white wealthy man might say, look, I get very uncomfortable when thinking about the possibility of a female black president. So if that person says, look, here's my feeling, here's my emotion, you have to take that into account, right? Because this might promote human thriving. So how exactly do we push back against that kind of an objection? Well, here, Jaggar introduces a theory in epistemology that we're going to sketch very briefly, but there is an enormous literature on it, so I encourage you to go explore it. It's a view called standpoint epistemology. So the idea of standpoint epistemology is that our understanding of the world, our knowledge about the world, depends on our social standing. So the idea is that the subordinated, those people who tend to be marginalized within a society, they have a kind of epistemological privilege that those in the mainstream don't have. The epistemological privilege is that they don't see the society through the distorting lens of the dominant class. So, for example, when thinking about, right, so let's go back to our example of homosexuality. So, the dominant class in the 1950s, we might imagine, would say something like homosexuality is sort of bad kind of desires, one ought not have that, and that eschewing homosexual desires is necessary for our society to thrive. Well, that kind of a view, that kind of an emotional response reflects the desires of the dominant class, reflects sort of the standing and the privilege of the dominant class. And so what standpoint epistemology encourages us to do is to consider those values from the perspective of folks with homosexual desires. And from that perspective, we get a better view of the nature of these kinds of desires, right? And the view is better in this case because it isn't subject to the distorting view of the dominant class. So, what Jaggar wants us to do then is to consider these outlaw emotions that we have and to consider them from the perspective of the subordinate classes. Right? And when we do this, we can make tiny changes in our emotional responses. Right? Now, emotions tend to be kind of sluggish to change. And so when we make these changes in perspective, it's going to be just a little bit of nudging at a time. And that's why, for Jaggar, we conceptualize this process as an upward spiral. That what we do is we build on our past progress to move forward in the future to create a society and a culture in which everybody can thrive.